So last week we began this series called Rhythm by talking about developing a rhythm of prayer in our lives, and we're going to continue that this morning. But you know, all of us have rhythms that we don't even really know about in our lives, right? Some of you, every morning before work, go to the same coffee shop and order the same thing. Who's there? Same coffee shop, same drink. Mike, what's your drink of choice? What are we sipping on right now? Hazelnut latte. You're one of the sweet guys like me. See, all of my friends make fun of me because I don't want the real thing. I love the $4 cup of sweetness, but the straight drip, I just don't get the point of it. How many of you are straight drip coffee drinkers?
What?
And right now, you're feeling a little bit egotistical. Right? You're feeling a little superior to the rest of us who don't go down that path, and I'm okay with that. It's always funny. So when someone, I was with a friend at Starbucks yesterday, at a coffee shop yesterday. It wasn't Starbucks, and he said he was going to buy, but I knew that he just drank the drip, right? And so I knew that hey, his is going to be $1, mine's going to be $4. I need to buy, and so I bought, and it was a good time with him. But we have rhythms. How many of you actually pick out your clothes the night before?
Ooh, right here.
And you raise them high. This is something to be proud of, or really embarrassed of. And how many of you, literally, you get up and just randomly, you just put something on?
No.
I can tell. That's great. Some things in life are obvious. But right, we have these rhythms. Some of you have certain websites. As soon as you open your computer in the office, there are certain websites you go to, right? And many of you, I'm not going to tell your bosses this, but many of you from 8 to 9, if you're in the office from 8 to 9, you're not doing any work, right? You're catching up on March Madness if you're a sports fan. You're going to your favorite news site. You're checking your stocks for the day, right? Because the East Coast is already flowing over there, right? So we're checking that, and then we're finally, later on, we're going to get into what we do. We all have rhythms in our lives. And one thing we want to talk about is how can we live lives that are intentional? And the only way to live an intentional life in any area of our lives, relationally, spiritually, financially, what we do vocationally, is to create rhythms in our lives, right? And so we want to create rhythms. But, well, you're not going to create rhythms in your life accidentally. Does that make sense? Like, you're not going to, hey, I want to be skinny. That's not going to make you skinny. Right? We've all tried it, right? But we could sell that like hotcakes. Right? We could get rid of that. That was a way to live. But I want to talk this morning about creating a rhythm of generosity in our lives. If you have a Bible, I'm going to tell you in a moment where our text is for today. But one thing we love to do, just as a small gift and blessing as a church, is we love just to hand out Bibles if you're a person that needs a Bible. So if you need a Bible this morning, just raise your hand. We're going to distribute them. They're coming to be bold about this. This is just a small gift to you. It's not as cool as Jacob's Storybook Bible. But if you would be interested in having one of the Bibles that we want to give to you, would you just raise your hand? Just so you can follow along with our text for this morning in regards to developing a rhythm of generosity. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. So it's like the 6th, 7th book, somewhere in there of the New Testament. It's after Romans. It's before Galatians. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Whoever has one of those Bibles, anybody can tell me what, Mary, can you tell me what page that is? 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Because it'll be a different page than what I've got up here. What is it? 828. If you have one of the Epic Gift Bibles, it's on page 828. 828. Now I want to tell you why this is such an interesting text. Paul is speaking to the church at Corinth, and what he's trying to tell this church is, you need to be like the churches in Macedonia. And what he's going to do is he's going to speak into how incredible the generosity of the example church is, and then he's going to try to motivate them from there to become a similar kind of generous church. Okay? A similar generous church. Now, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, we will be in verses 1 through 9. Here's what Paul, who's the apostle writing this, here's what he says. In verse 1, he says, "We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed into wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected. Let's take care of this real quick. If you've got Epic Kids number 114, they need you, right? And then if we can get the scripture back on the screen, that would be awesome. Sorry about that. So a lot of you are depending on the screen, I can tell. Awesome. All right, let's start over. Cool with that? We want to get the whole thing in context, so here we go. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Verse 6. Accordingly, we urge Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you this act of grace. But as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all earnestness, and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. And we'll finish here with verse 9. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. I want to begin by pointing out what I think is one of the most surprising verses in the entire Bible. What verse 2 does is very interesting. If we could have verse 2 up there, that would be great. What verse 2 does is it brings together things that we assume are mutually exclusive. Let me show you how this works. In verse 2, it says that though they were in the midst of affliction, they had an abundance of joy. Now, how many of us, let's be honest, how many of us assume that we can have joy in the midst of affliction? Right? We believe oftentimes that these two things are mutually exclusive. True? That joy equals the absence of affliction, or that affliction equals the absence of joy. And so what Paul's trying to do with this church in Macedonia, he's saying, hey, they were in the middle of an affliction, and yet they had joy. And let me tell you why this is good news for you, and it's really good news for me. I now know that my joy doesn't have to be tied to my circumstances. Does that make sense? So much of my life, my joy, I've allowed it to be dictated, and you have too, let's be honest. We've allowed our joy to be dictated by the circumstances we have in life, right? And so, if our circumstances are great, then we feel like our joy is up here, and if they're not so great, then there is no joy. But what if it is true, like this church in Macedonia 2,000 years ago discovered, what if it's true that even in the midst of circumstances that we wouldn't choose for ourselves, joy can still be present, right, Jacob? Yes. If the rest of you would respond like this 8-month-old, that would be awesome. It's a really novel concept to me, that in the midst of trials, in the midst of difficulty, there can still be joy. Isn't it great to know that our joy isn't tied to the stock market? Did anybody have stock over the last 3 or 4 years? Isn't it great to know that our stock, or our joy, is not tied to the stock market? Amen. And it isn't tied, or it doesn't have to be tied to how stressful things are at work right now. That our joy can be tied to something deeper. Our joy can be tied to something that's firmer than our circumstances. If you and I attach our joy to what our circumstances are, then our joy, we will not be able to guarantee that it will be there when we wake up in the morning. But if you and I attach our joy to something that's more firmly grounded, if you and I attach our joy to something that isn't wavering, then there's a good chance, regardless of what happens in the world tomorrow, regardless of what happens in our city, regardless of what happens with the economy, that our joy can still be present. And I just want to take a guess here, but my guess is that most of us still don't believe that. It's a difficult lesson. There are a couple of other things that seem to be mutually exclusive in verse 2. It says that their extreme poverty has overflowed in a wealth of generosity. So it says in terms of their finances, this church was extremely poor. But in terms of their generosity, this church was extremely wealthy. Here's another very freeing theme for us this morning. Generosity is not tied to our wealth. And we know this is a little more true than the last thing, right? We all know wealthy people who are not generous whatsoever, don't we? And hopefully we also know people that don't have the means of the wealthy that aren't necessarily all that well off, and yet we can find them to be very generous people. At the same time, you can find wealthy people who are very generous, and you can find poor people who aren't generous at all. They have a little bit and they hoard it and they're stingy with it and they hold on to it as tight as they can. So it's a really interesting, almost like this juxtaposition, this mutually exclusive thing that we normally understand. He's saying in terms of their finances, they're extremely poor. In terms of their generosity, they're extremely wealthy. It goes on in verse 4. He says that this church, they begged us to take part in the relief of the saints. This is this church in Macedonia, they wanted to be a part of what God was doing in the world. They didn't have the greatest means. We've already read that. It says extreme poverty, right? So there's a definitive word here, and very definitive adjective. It's not just that they were in poverty. They were in extreme poverty and great affliction. And yet at the same time, they had a wealth of generosity. And here's the reason why, verse 4. They wanted to take part in what God was doing in their world. Can we be honest? Every one of us can come up with a long list of excuses why we shouldn't be generous. True. A long list. Right? We need to take care of ourselves. We don't know that the money we have in the bank, we don't know what's going to happen to it. And there's a certain sense in which, of course, you and I need to use the wisdom that God's given us, right? You need to have something saved up, right? You need to have that emergency fund. You need to be prepared, if at all possible. But at some time, we've got to go, how much is enough? Right? How much must I have? And then in verse 7 here of chapter 8, he says this to them. Now I know our church, and those of you here this morning, we are full of goal setters. Like, how many of you are just goal setters in some realm of life? Raise your hand. We're going to make fun of everyone who isn't. Because when you aim at nothing, you hit. When you aim at nothing, you hit. Yeah, come on. I mean, it's cliche-ish. A lot of goal setters in this room. So you work for someone who makes you set goals, or many of you in this room are bosses, and you make your people set goals for what profitability is going to be, for what their schedule is going to be. And they have measurable goals, and they need to be able to meet these goals. And so coming into 2011, we all had goals of losing more weight, of making more money. But how many of us had the goal of excelling in generosity? I didn't. But he says, as you excel in everything, so as you excel, as you grow in your faith, as you're more carefully crafting how you speak to people, as you grow in your knowledge and your wisdom and in your earnestness, how passionate you are in what you're doing, and in your love, see that you also excel in this act of giving, this act of grace, this act of generosity. There's a reason why the title of this message isn't sporadic generosity. It's rhythm of generosity. Some of us in this room, we are sporadically generous, right? You see somebody, you have a few extra bucks, you're generous in that moment. But I think we've got to get down to being intentional with everything in our lives, including our generosity. Right? It's an old saying, right? If you don't, if you fail to plan, then your plan's going to fail, right? I mean, this is nothing newsworthy here. The same thing is true in our generosity. Now, there's a place for spontaneous generosity. Let's talk a couple of examples. Right? The recent tragedy in Japan. None of us saw that coming. And so in that moment, we go, man, there's room for spontaneous generosity. There's an instant need, or you have a neighbor that all of a sudden has an emergency. Spontaneous generosity. But with the rest of your generosity, let's try to make it intentional. Let's don't just have aimless generosity. Let's be intentional. Let's create a rhythm in our lives. Because if you just are sporadically generous, then here's how this plays out. When you have nothing else better to do, then you open up your home to someone else for a minute. Right? But if you're intentional with your generosity, what if you said, hey, as often as we're in town, on Thursday nights, we're going to try to have other individuals or other family people over. Right? even with church or another charitable cause. If you're just sporadically generous, then what you say is, what do I have in my pocket, or at the end of the month, what's left in my checking account? But if you're intentional, you know what, I can automate that. And not just for our church, but other charitable causes, right? We do it with our bills. We're intentional with our bills. We're not sporadic with paying the electricity bill, are we? Right? I mean, we're not getting 3 out of 12 months and life being okay. So let's be intentional with our generosity. Let's have a plan for how we're going to be generous. One of the things I learned from one of my friends in this room actually is he and his wife, as they were, walking around San Francisco, there's lots of people looking for different handouts, right? They're looking for money, or they've got a skill and they're trying to raise money for that. Well, for me, I'm just like, I'll just be sporadic with it. When I feel like I've got some extra, I'll throw it their way, and I don't. But he and his wife have come to a kind of a real intentional decision that, hey, we're going to find an organization that really takes care of the homeless in our city, and we're going to give a set amount on a monthly basis to that organization. And I was like, that's a great idea, rather than just being sporadically generous. Again, do not leave here saying that pastor is not leaving room for spontaneous generosity. I want to leave room for that. But also, it will help us if our mind's made up ahead of time what we're going to do, not just with our money, but what we're going to do with our influence. See, if you are sporadically generous with people who work under you, let's say they're just getting into the workforce that you're in, and some of those people are in the room this morning. If you're sporadically generous, then if you ever find a 15-minute window, you might tell them what they need to be doing, or you might give them some advice. But if you're intentional with your generosity, what if you just say, hey, 2 hours every Thursday morning, every Tuesday afternoon, I'm going to invite 5 or 6 people that are in their first year of our company, and I'm going to pour advice into them, I'm going to pour wisdom into them, I'm going to share with them. Because one of the things that this church in Macedonia is they were very intentional with their generosity. Now, I want to give you 4 words that I really think determine whether or not you or I ultimately will be generous. How we view these words. The first word is this: source. If you're a note taker, just write down the word source. The first word is source. Part of what determines your level or no level of generosity in your life and in my life is who or what we believe the source is for the things we have in our lives. Let me play this out for you. If you believe you're the source of what you have in your life, meaning that you're smart enough so you've earned it, or you're talented enough so you deserve it, or you were born into the right family, then you believe you're owed what you have. Right? Does that make sense? So it's a source issue. If you believe that you're the source, then what you're saying is, hey, I have worked hard for this, I'm entitled to this, and I don't owe anyone. It's up to me to do this. I've made this for myself. I'm going to enjoy it for myself. And that's the end of the generosity story. But if you see God as the source of what you have in terms of your brain, or in terms of your talent, or in terms of your relationships, or in terms of the family you were born into, it's a very different thing. And I just want to ask you, those of you, and we all struggle with this, but those of you that say, you know what, I'm kind of entitled to what I have. Now, I just have a few questions. One is, who gave you the brain that's in your head that's making the magic work for you? Who gave you the natural talents and abilities? How do you... Now, somebody would say, well, I was given some, but I worked the rest. I agree with that, but you didn't go from zero completely on your own, did you? Who caused you to be born in the family that you were born in? Right, we're praying for Jacob to do great things with his life and to understand God's purpose for his life this morning. And God has certainly given him a great set of parents. But part of what his future is going to be dictated by certainly is going to be what he gets from his parents. But guess what? God has given him to this family. So no matter how far you take it back, ultimately, I think we need to see God as the source of everything that we have that's good in our lives. As a source. The second word is capacity. If you look at verse 3, it says that the Macedonians, they gave according to their means. And here's something I want to free you with. God is never wanting you to be generous with something you don't have. Does that make sense? It's very obvious, very elementary saying. But God is never going to ask you, and here's another thing. God is never going to ask you to give generously, but He's going to ask me to give generously. Right? And so if you're a person with lots of wisdom, then God's going to desire that you give more wisdom away than I have, because I'm a little bit, okay, maybe I'm a lot lower on the totem pole when it comes to wisdom. If you don't have a spacious home to live in, like if you're living in a studio right now and you've got 300 square feet, God's not wanting you to have 25 people over there, because those people won't like you when they leave, right? But if God's giving you more space than that, then you have an opportunity to be more generous. All of us in this room, we have different allocations of time during the week, don't we? All of us would say we're busy, but some of us are busier than others. True? And what's amazing for my wife and I now, we have 3 little boys, 3, 5, and 7. And we used to literally think, when we were newlyweds, we used to literally think we were crazy busy. We had tons of time back then, and we didn't even know it. So God is not going to ask us, if you're single in the room and you have a job that's literally like 9 to 5, guess what? You have more capacity when it comes to your time than we do. So I don't want to ask, what are we all doing equally in this room? I'm asking, in regards to the capacity that you've been giving, how are you stewarding your capacity? Where you live, how much time you have to invest in good things and be generous with others. How are you stewarding your influence? Again, we're all on the spectrum, right? Some of us have no influence, we think. Others of us have very influence. We're so influential. You guys are determining things in our city and in our world. What do you do with your capacity? The third one is just the issue of trust. Scarcity says that if I give something away, then I'm going to be lacking something, right? Scarcity, if I live within the parameters or the boundaries of scarcity, it means that I believe that if I give something away generously, then I'm going to be lacking something. But really, trust is tied deeply to this idea of source that we talked about first, right? Because if you believe God's the source of all good things that you have, and He's blessed you immensely, then you will be a person who's able to give things away because you trust that that same God is going to continue to bestow blessing upon you in your life. So how are you doing with generosity? How are you doing with generosity? Paul says, as you excel in everything else, excel also in this act of being generous. How are you doing with it? Every one of us in this room, we're somewhere along the continuum, and the continuum is this. We're either not generous, like completely, there's no generosity at all, or we're completely generous. And most of us fall somewhere else along the timeline, right? Some of us used to be more generous than we are now, and we've allowed, let's be honest, we've allowed our generosity to be tied to our financial circumstance. And there's a way in which that has to be true, right? But will you and I be willing to trust that God, who is the source of the good things, that if we give things away, if we steward well the gifts He's given us, do we not think we can trust Him for the rest of our own future? Let's think how crazy this is, right? Let's go with logic for a moment. So God blesses us so that we can be a blessing. If we have that belief, and I want to encourage you to approach that belief, then how can we also have the belief that, okay, God wants to bless me so that I will bless other people, but then I can't depend on God to continue blessing me? Does that make sense? When in reality, what I found to be true in my own life is the more I'm willing to allow blessing to flow from God through my life to others, the more God blesses me. Now, this is not a get-rich-quick scheme, okay? Everybody, you have not heard Pastor Ben say, go give $100,000 away and you'll have $1 million next week. Right? You haven't heard me say that. But the more that we allow God's blessing to operate in a manner in which we're just a conduit of that blessing, right? So we're not hoarding everything, we're not stingy, we're not greedy, because there's not scarcity with God. God is not limited by the stock market. He's not limited by how big your home is or isn't. He isn't limited by the influence you think you have or you don't have. God isn't limited by time, even though He's given us 24 hours a day to be generous with our time. He's not a God who is limited. Can't we trust Him? Now let's go with the fourth word. The fourth word is motivation. If you have one of those Bibles, or if we can get it on the screen, I'm going to show you something in verse 9 regarding motivation. Because here's what's interesting. There's a group of people in need, But I want you to know first, here's what the motivation wasn't. The motivation to help this other church wasn't there is this huge need and you need to do what you can to help these people out. And the motivation wasn't, hey, this is just your duty. You need to be generous because it's a good thing to do. He gives an incredible motivation. And if you haven't been interested in anything else or haven't heard anything else, would you be willing to give the next 3 or 4 minutes just to understand what Paul's saying? It's so interesting. He would share this incredible good news. It's really, this is the heart of the Christian faith. This is what separates Christianity. The reality of the history of Jesus is what differentiates us. And he gives us this in the midst of a message on generosity. And I want to see how the two tie. Here's the motivation. He says, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. Now, why does he throw this in when he's giving them an exhortation or an encouragement on the idea of generosity? Here's why. He's saying the greatest motivation isn't the need. The number one thing that's going to make you or I generous in this room, it isn't the need of other people. And it's not going to be because we feel like it's our civic duty or even our Christian duty to be good people and give things away. It says the chief motivation is that when you consider Jesus, who though he was rich, what does that mean? It means that Jesus has created all things, that everything is at his disposal, that everything, whether we like it or not, is in submission to his authority. Yet he did something for us. He emptied his riches, he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, through his giving up, through his gracious, extravagant generosity, you might become rich. And what does that mean? Again, it's not monetarily. It means that Jesus comes to earth from heaven so that you and I wouldn't be left alone, so that we simply wouldn't be left to ourselves, because we know how dangerous it is to be left to ourselves. It means that he gives up so that you and I might attain what he's giving up. It means that he lays his life down so that we might get what he's enjoyed from eternity past, forever and ever and ever. So in regards to generosity, let me ask you, who do you see as the source of the things that you have in your life? Honestly. Who or what is the source of the things that you enjoy in your life? Secondly, what's your current capacity? Let's don't talk about your future like you'll give when or you'll have more time when. What's your current capacity? What's your current time allocation? What's your current salary? What are the current earthly material things that you've been blessed with? What's the current square footage of your home? How much influence do you have right now? What's your capacity? It says these people, they gave according to their means. You can't give according to anything else. And what God expects from me is not going to be what he expects from you. What God desires me to give in this world is not going to be, and here's the thing too, what God may have desired you to give maybe 2 years ago when you were at another life stage, it may be completely different now. Maybe you have less money, maybe you have more. Maybe you have less time, maybe you have more. Maybe you have not even a home that's your own, like you just have a room somewhere. Or maybe you have more space than you've ever had in your life. But what's your current capacity? 3, do you believe that if you live generously that you can trust God to continue to meet your needs? And are you willing to put that belief in action? And then fourthly, what's your motivation? Those of you that consider Epic your church, I don't want you to support our church because it's just a good thing to do. I want this to be your motivation. Because of what he's done for us, that more people in the city might see what he's done for them. What's your motivation? For you that are investing in other people's lives, could you do it simply not because it's your civic or religious duty? Could you do it because of the room and the space that God's made for us? Could you carve out space for others because He's carved out space for us. And in regards to rhythm, like I'm not going to ask everyone to tell us what your age is in this room, okay? But most of us in this room are between the ages of 20 and 60. And here's what I want to say. I don't care what your current income is, even if it's non-existent. I don't care what your current capacity is. I don't care what your current influence is. The question is this. Do you understand that sometime later is never going to lead to generosity? Do not fool yourself. Do not fool yourself, and let me not fool myself. My circumstances changing will not make me a generous person. Your circumstances changing will not make you generous people. So is it time to create a rhythm of generosity in our lives? And if so, we need to be intentional. On the back of that card, I referenced a second ago, it just has some ways for you to think through it. How will you be intentionally generous with your finances? I think there's one with your relationships, with your time. And if you're not intentional, chances are you're not going to be able to play out a life of generosity. I also want to say this. There is a pastor in New York City. His name is Nelson Searcy. And he's really helped our church in many, many ways get off the ground here 3,000 miles away. And he sent us a couple of cases of books called The Generosity Ladder. And Tim, will you just raise your hand? Tim's got a table full of books back there. Diana has them as well. It's a real short book. It's talking about how we can be generous with our finances. And it also realizes, again, we said this last week, how many of you have ever run a marathon? Shame the rest of us. Yeah, that's impressive. Who else has ever ran a half marathon? 5K. Keep your hands up, everybody. The marathon runners are feeling superior to the rest of us. How many of you have ever walked a mile? All right. See, there's room for everyone. Well, here's what we said last week, is that none of us in this room are going to go from sitting on the couch all of our lives to running a marathon the next day, right? But the question is, if you were racing, what's the next step in heading towards running a marathon? Some of you in this room, I have no doubt, you may not be generous at all. Okay, let's not talk about being extravagantly generous, but let's just ask this question. What would the first step look like for me to start working towards generosity? This book is just a small book. It would be a help to you, though, I think. I want to pray for you this morning, and I want to pray really directly, and I want you to just look at me in the eyes. I want to tell you what I'm praying for. The first thing I'm praying for, before we talk about generosity, is that you get the motivation. You understand, regardless of how wealthy you are or aren't, regardless of what your experience has been with religion or hasn't. One of the reasons we started this church is because we don't really care for religion. We're like, what? We care deeply about a Jesus movement happening in our city, but we don't really care about religion. We're not here for rules and rituals. We're here to have life-transforming experiences with the one who gave it all up. So my first hope for you is that. Secondly, what would it look like? What kind of collective force for good could Epic be in our city if we began to head towards, at least, radical generosity? The implications are huge. The future will be different based on what you and I do with whether or not we're going to be generous. Let's live for the good of the city and the hope of the world. You guys pray with me? God, I thank you that you are a good and you're a generous God. God, I believe that you're the source of all of the good things that we have in our lives. You've given us wisdom. You've given us intellect. God, you have put us in certain families. You've put us in certain organizations and companies. God, I pray that we wouldn't simply see that as what we've earned or what we deserve. God, you're completely generous to us. And even so much as you sent Jesus and he gave up his riches so that one day we could have the riches of heaven. That's a huge deal. God, I pray that you would make me a more generous man with my time. God, with the influence you've given me, with the financial blessing you've given to my family. I pray the same for every person in this room. God, whatever place we are along this line, the continuum between not generous and very generous. God, would you help every man and woman and family and couple in this room to take the next step towards generosity? God, it's exciting to imagine what might happen if our church here in San good in our city and to bring hope to our world. Would you teach us? Would you show us what the next step as a church and as an individual are? Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.